Hello, everyone. I can see that my slides are live, so I'm hoping that you can hear me. And if you do, can you please let me know in chat or via a signal from the participants with me? Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Raphael. Well, my name is Josh Moorkens. You'll have seen me in the last few minutes probably as part of the previous session, as part of the panel, so I don't need to introduce myself to any great extent. I'm going to speak to you for the next little while about ethics and technology in the translation industry. Now, this talk draws from two different publications that I was involved with recently, and I'll tell you a little bit about those in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Amelia Perez and to Martin Giovkosh for inviting me to come and speak to you as part of the TIC conference. There are a couple of interactions that I've involved with this using Slido. It may not work. If it doesn't work, my apologies. So first of all, I want to speak a little bit about business ethics, about corporate social responsibility, and the stakeholder approach to business ethics. And that part is drawn from a chapter written by myself and Marta Rocky as part of the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Ethics, co-edited by Nika Pokorn and Kaisa Koskinen. Then I want to speak about technology ethics, primarily to do with neural machine translation, looking at NMT system development, NMT and professional workflows. And that part is drawn from a book chapter from the Multi-Train MT project that will be coming out on Langside Press over the next few months, edited by Dorothy Kenny. And then finally, I want to finish up by speaking a little bit about sustainability and diversity. So a number of people have written in the past about ethics in the translation industry, mostly with more of a focus on translators themselves rather than on the industry as a whole or on technology in translation. So for example, Maria Timoshko and very much Christina Abdallah have written about asymmetries of power. Christina Abdallah's writing was very relevant to the writing I've done more recently in this area. Joe Drugan in the University of East Anglia has written about social responsibility and responsibility to clients. Andrew Chesterman and Anthony Pym on relationships between actors in translation networks and on trust. And Michael Cronin, my former TCU colleague, on distributed production networks. But there hasn't really tended to be a focus on business ethics or technology ethics previously in translation beyond that. So that's where I hope myself and Marta have added with our recent chapter. So in the previous session, there was a short introduction at the beginning on ethics, but one of the origins of the idea of ethics is this idea of the good life. So when Socrates, as reported by Plato, was put to death, he said, the many are able to put us to death, but the most important thing is not life, but the good life. So this idea of the good life, philosophy aims to identify what is a good life, not just acceptable, but excellent and worthy of admiration. Aristotle noted that ethics are inexact and uncertain, and that's perhaps what makes it an interesting area. So writing and studies of ethics are often divided into two primary groups. There's theoretical ethics, which asks, what is the best theory of the good life? So that might look at utilitarianism based on weighing up the consequences, deontological ethics, which is based very much on rules, or virtue ethics based on human excellence, flourishing. And there have been various parts or various types of offshoots from these sort of basic theoretical ethical theories. There's also applied ethics, which asks, how should we act in this or that situation based upon our best theories of ethics? So here we might be looking at data ethics, machine ethics, business ethics, computer and information ethics. So moving specifically to business ethics, this defines and discusses ethical principles for business. It applies to the conduct of working individuals and of entire organizations. And the credo, as I mentioned in the previous section, from the 1970s came from Milton Friedman's focus primarily, well, wholly on profit. The title of his article from 1970 was "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase its Profits." And that's something that we can see in translation in the largely freelance and contingent work practices, the unilateral imposition of technologies purely to bring down costs and focus on the profit motive. Not that profit, as we mentioned previously, isn't important, but by the 1990s, there was more of a consideration of corporate social responsibility, a balancing of different responsibilities. So Carroll's corporate responsibility pyramid that you can see here on the right-hand side focused on the foundation of being profitable, but also there were other responsibilities. And he did suggest that these are subordinate, but are important. So, for example, the economic focus is to maximize shareholder earnings, to be profitable, to be competitive, to be efficient. So success is still profitability, according to Carroll. Then subordinate to this are legal responsibilities, but equally important, well, not equally, but very important, because the profit motive is limited by the law. So Carroll saw it as important to perform in line with the expectations of the law, to comply with regulation, not necessarily the spirit of the law, but the expectations of the law, that goods must at least meet minimal legal requirements. So follow laws as society's codification of right and wrong, play by the rules of the game. Next up is ethical responsibilities. Be ethical. Follow consistently with the expectations of societal mores and ethical norms. Do what's right, just and fair. Avoid harm. Recognize how these mores might change over time and recognize that corporate integrity and ethical behavior go beyond mere compliance with laws and regulations. And then, important but least important, are the philanthropic responsibilities. Be a good corporate citizen, contribute resources to the community, improve quality of life. It's important to perform in a manner consistent with the philanthropic and charitable expectations of society, in the arts, in education, in community projects. Over time, writers in business ethics have gone beyond this. In 1994, Elkington introduced what he called his triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. And he didn't necessarily suggest that one was more important than the other. And this is often seen as sort of an accounting challenge, trying to balance these. But in 2018, he came back as a corrective and said that the goal from the outset was system change, pushing towards the transformation of capitalism. It was never supposed to be just an accounting system. Related to this, DeGeorge in 2014 said that it's important to respect the rights of employees, of consumers, of society in general. So within translation, as cropped up in the last session, we have several coexisting modes of work and value models. So there's casualization, there's globalization, there's digitalization, but it's not rife throughout. An employer may compromise on quality while still producing a fit-for-purpose translation. Pim noted that the added cost in deciphering a text is then moved to the end user. But there are many employers that try to create long-term relationships with their translators and to focus on quality. So there are lots of different coexisting modes of work, coexisting value models. There are full-time or paraprofessional part-time workers on a freelance basis, on an in-house basis for companies or for institutions. But we are seeing more and more freelance work. Even the Directorate General for Translation in the European Commission increasingly outsources work to the less stable translation marketplace. And there are issues of ownership and copyright, as mentioned by Venuti in his Scandals of Translation. And that's something that I'll come back to when talking more to do with technology and neural machine translation. So Mele in 2019 asked what the purpose of a company is. And he said that a translation company sets its mission in line, well, not just, he wasn't looking purely at translation, but he said that a company sets its mission in line with the stakeholder or the common good approach, or the shareholder approach. So the shareholder approach focuses on maximizing return for shareholders. Stakeholders looks at the various stakeholders, the various people involved within and without the company. The common good approach looks at society more general. Mele says that taking ethics as a guide for human excellence, business ethics can be a guide for human excellence in business organizations. So in a translation company, if they set their mission in line with the stakeholder or the common good approach, it doesn't ignore the interest of shareholders, because profitability is always key, because it's most important that the company or the organization continues and sustains itself, and it won't do so without turning a profit, or at very least breaking even. However, going beyond the mere generation of profit helps with viewing the company as a community of people working for a common purpose, rather than a set of contracts that need to be respected. So Mele feels that a business achieves excellence when, through its activity, it contributes to the good of society. A company operating in the translation industry enhances society by allowing people to understand each other, to extend the use of goods and services to populations where these goods and services would not be able to circulate without a common language used between the provider of the good or service and the different intermediaries or final users. So some of the stakeholders in a translation company, we suggest, are in the diagram on the right-hand side. So stakeholder theory considers shareholders, but also employees, customers, suppliers, financiers, communities, governmental bodies, political groups, trade associations, trade unions, and even competitors. It was first introduced by Ed Freeman in 1984. And then there was further work by Phillips, where he was bringing in Rawls' theory of fair play, and he provided a further division between what he called normative and derivative stakeholders. So the normative stakeholders are the ones that we should consider most important, more directly involved. Then derivative stakeholders are those external to the organization. Now, using this stakeholder approach does still imply a certain sort of political view, and both Freeman and Phillips have defined themselves as libertarian and individualistic in a way that they're very clear and proud about. But nonetheless, it's a good way of even if you're not of that view, it's a good way of thinking and considering all of the parties involved in the translation process. In translation, we, i.e. myself and Marta, try to consider disparities of power, ownership of resources, sustaining employment ethics training as CPD, and the importance of trust. Chesterman has asked, why should translators be loyal to their profession? Why should they be accountable to various other participants in the communication situation? And his answer would be, because of the overriding value of trust. And Abdallah and Koskinen in 2007 show the importance of trust in a translation production network. Anthony Pym has said to build trust is also to reduce transaction costs, because if relationships are not transactional and are actually based on trust, that lowers the cost of the transaction. So in the chapter that we've written, which you can have a look at, there's a pre-pub version available, and It's available on ResearchGate or via the Dublin City University resource, DORIS, D-O-R-I-S. You can see full details of where we consider these disparities of power between the derivative and normative stakeholders, between freelancers and shareholders and in-company workers. We look at the ownership of resources, the importance of sustaining employment, and the importance of trust. But some of these topics also come up when we're looking at technology, and that's where I'll move to now. So you'll have seen various diagrams that look much like this previously, how the global data sphere is growing. There's an exponential growth in the amount of digital content being created. Year on year, we're creating more and more content. But according to the International Data Corporation, one of the key differentiators in the change over time in this creation of content is this real-time data, this increase of real-time data. So what we're seeing is the need for real-time or almost immediate translation, because this data is being created in real time. There's an expectation of audiences that they can also receive it in real time or near enough to real time. Yota Georgikopoulou in audiovisual translation has talked about how near live turnaround times is associated with the predicted doubling of the revenues of over-the-top or video on demand organizations over the next coming years. So translation velocity is key. And with velocity comes pressures to bring in technology and to try and speed up translation processes. So ethics and technology is a real growing area. The world's largest technical professional organization, the IEEE, the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, is now an entire division devoted just to technology ethics. Well-designed and well-used technologies can make it easier for people to live well, for example, by allowing more efficient use and distribution of essential resources for a good life, food, water, energy, or medical care. Poorly designed or misused technologies can make it harder to live well, for example, by toxifying our environment or reinforcing unsafe, unhealthy, or antisocial habits. So there's a growing consensus about the importance of ethics in technology. Technology increasingly shapes how human beings seek the good life and with what degree of success. And increasingly, it's seen that technology is not ethically neutral, but rather reflects the values of the designer. It's something that was suggested by Langdon Winner as far back as 1983, by Kranzberg in 1986, Andrew Feenberg in 1999, that technologies reveal and shape what humans value and think good. And these values that the designer and the implementer put forth govern the problem addressed by the technology. The decision to create the technology, the method of implementation, its intended users, the references or training data used, the processing of that data, the location and security of data storage, and the limits to access to the technology based perhaps on the geographical location. And this is a very timely question, as I've mentioned. The reason for tech ethics becoming important now is for reasons of fairness, of justice, of responsibility. We're thinking more critically about technology due to the speed, the scale, the pervasiveness of technology, and policy and law is inevitably at least one step behind. So ethics and law are interrelated, but are not quite the same thing. It's more than legal responsibility and fulfilling of legal responsibility. 21st century technologies are reshaping the global distribution of power, of justice and responsibility. And positive and negative impacts we're finding are often distributed unevenly. For example, face and voice recognition algorithms can be used to track and create a lasting digital record of movements and actions in public, even in places where you would have felt more or less anonymous. And there's no consistent legal framework governing this kind of data collection, even though it could potentially be used to expose a person's medical history by recording where they went when they went to medical or mental health facilities, whether they went to religious or attend services, their status as a victim of violence if they visit a victim services agency or a police station, or other sensitive information up to and including the content of their personal conversations in the street. It applies differently depending on race. What does a person with access to personal data or tasked with analyzing it need to understand about its ethical significance and power to affect a person's life? These ideas of justice, fairness, and responsibility are key. So we need to ask how we ensure that access to the enormous benefits promised by new technologies and the exposure to their risks are distributed in a right and fair way. And key to this are considerations of big data, large digital data sets, and new techniques, organizations and processes to transform those data sets into valuable human knowledge. The big data phenomenon has been enabled by a wide range of computing innovations in data generation in mining, scraping, sampling, artificial intelligence and machine learning, natural language and image processing, computer modeling, simulation, cloud computing and storage. And thanks to our increasingly sophisticated tools for turning large data sets into useful insights, new industries have sprung up around the production of various forms of data analytics, including predictive analytics and user analytics. Meyer, Schoenberger, and Kukier have said that big data's value is in current and potential future use. Jaron Lanier has said that both big data and artificial intelligence, he's defined them as economic and political constructions that disenfranchise most people. In Who Owns the Future, he calls big data a ubiquitous term used to describe the massive amounts of information being gathered in every possible way about everyone and everything in order to make algorithms that are called artificial intelligence seem to function on their own. The fact that big data is needed is proof that these algorithms are actually only a repackaging of human effort in such a way that it is anonymized and people aren't acknowledged or paid. So there are two different views, as you can see of this. There's the more skeptical view, or the view that big data will and continues to have value. And ethical issues are everywhere in the world. Data creates a perfect storm of ethical risks, the risks of perpetuation of bias, of the sale and transfer of personal information, of powerful but potentially misleading or misused data analytics, a data-saturated and poorly regulated commercial environment, and the absence of widespread, well-designed standards for data practice in industry, in universities, in profit or non-profit or government sectors. And we're seeing more and more organizations trying to deal with that, trying to change and manage how we deal with data. So why translation data ethics? Well, we know there's a huge growth in the production of digital data, and there's more types of data gathered in translation than ever before. Big data is driving new businesses and new processes in translation. Consideration of ethics can help with decision-making, but may also present opportunities. And as Anthony Pym has mentioned, it's very important for us to learn to trust and mistrust data. So what types of data are collected in translation? It's bilingual translation data that's been translated for a long time within translation memory or CAT tool or TENT interfaces. Timing data. How long did it take to translate a segment or a document? Timing data. How long was the user active on this task? So if we're assuming that a translator spends 8 hours on a task, now we can look more carefully if we have timing data and see how long they actually spent. Did they spend 2 hours or 4 hours? Even how long they went to the bathroom or went off for a coffee? Keystrokes. What keys are hit? Mouse clicks. translation quality evaluation. Response times. How quickly do they respond to emails? Adherence to instructions and to deadlines. Demographic data. Where are they? How old are they? What gender are they? The sort of data that Arndt Lieke Jacobsen, Michael Karl, and colleagues have been collecting within the likes of Translog are now commonplace within translation interfaces, particularly the increasingly popular platform interfaces. They can be used for MT, but also for predictive pricing and for lights out project management, deciding which translator or vendor to go to automatically, sending it out automatically based on responses, or maybe based on historical records of translation quality evaluation. So I have two case studies, two stories that I've compiled not from one single person's experiences, but I want to see what you consider, what issues you see in these case studies of data use in translation. So you should be able to answer these questions by going to slido.com and entering hashtag TIC21, and hopefully this will work. So the first case study. Translator A has freely signed a contract with their regular employer to carry out a translation on a freelance basis using a proprietary web-based platform, giving explicit permission for their translation data to be reused for MT training. The employer trains MT systems using the data from Translator A and from others. In time, NMT quality improves for Translator A's language pair to the extent that the company moves its translation work to post-editing and imposes a unilateral 30% discount on their per-word payment rate. This discount is applied on the basis that productivity has generally improved by roughly 30%, and that's visible to the company from the translation activity data gathered via the translation platform. In order to raise revenue, the company decides to sell MT services externally. This includes some work for an arms manufacturer. So, what issues do you see here? Please answer here. If the TIC version doesn't work, here's a hashtag that you can use on the left-hand side. In fact, the TIC one might not work. So maybe this is a better one to use. I'm going to try it myself and see if I can browse to slido.com. So where it says enter code here, enter 314383. Yeah, there's one response. Data ownership. Are there any other issues that you see for Translator A? Well, I'll move beyond this. We can talk about those. So aside from data ownership, we might consider issues of the permission to use data, issues of data distribution, of privacy, of personal data. So to do with data ownership, well, they've explicitly signed over their ownership as part of the contract. And this is something we discussed in the previous roundtable. Permission to use data, well, they've given explicit permission for their translation data to be reused for MT training, but the final use of that data is not transparent to them. and they don't really have any rights to limit the reuse of that data. So if their work is repurposed for an arms manufacturer, there's nothing they can really do about it. Then looking at data distribution, well, they have shared their data. It can be distributed without their say-so, but also their privacy and personal data can be shared. If there's a data breach, then that will be in breach of GDPR, and there'll be fines associated. But if not, then there isn't really anything that the individual translator can do. Case study 2. Translator B is opposed to MT as a matter of principle. This isn't that unusual. B accepts work for a company that expects translators to submit their translation memory with translated target texts, which they will repurpose for future human translation. Translator B is not aware that the work has been automatically assigned by an automated project management system, but there's no translation brief and no direct communication with the company. This also is not that unusual. Translator B is also not aware that the company will soon be acquired by a large conglomerate who will use all available data for MT training and offer it for sale. We've seen from the presentation by Dominic Graham at the ATC Language Industry Summit in 2019 that from 2016 to 2019, there were 82 acquisitions of translation and interpreting companies, 31 of those across border. More recently, we've seen the acquisition by RWS of FDL, of Iconic Translation Machines. We've seen the merger of SDI and Iuna Media. So this is something that does happen very often. The data, back to Translator B, should have all personal information removed before being shared, but this information is retained by accident when the data is uploaded to one purchaser. The company tries to keep this quiet so as to avoid liability. So this is something that shouldn't happen, but does happen in practice. There's a difficulty with regard to data breaches, not just regarding GDPR fines for those within the European Union, but also it's bad publicity, and companies do often try to keep data breaches quiet. There's been different agreements on labor rights of people working for digital platforms that are in progress, and in some areas there's now a presumption of employment. There's algorithms transparency that makes it mandatory for platforms to inform workers' legal representatives about the mathematical or algorithmic formula determining their working conditions. And there's the European level proposal for a regulation on a European approach for artificial intelligence, but very few of these have been enacted yet. So for Translator B, there's not really much that they can do. So if we look at issues with MT system training, it's the question of data ownership. And this goes back to the Berne Convention from 1868. So translation was at that point designated as subordinate and a derivative work subject to the rights of the original author. And that's basically where things still stand. There are differences from one jurisdiction to another. You can read about those if you look at the Bird and Bird report that was commissioned by the European Commission and published in 2014, or Cabanillas' book, The Legal Environment for Translation. Generally, permission to use data is assumed. There's no explicit permission asked or given to use data, and that will mean that translators don't have an option for their work being repurposed, retasked for the use for training MT or other AI systems. Data distribution, it might be limited to try and to stick within the agreement with large contracts, but otherwise it can be freely distributed as long as there's no data breach. But that brings the risk of a breach of privacy of personal data. And we might consider that a translation memory, for example, is personal data, but if it has the name of a translator appended to it, or even a pseudonym that can be linked back to that translator. There are also some jurisdictions in which it's considered that written work is an element of your own self, your own person. And there are moral rights that can be asserted to do with ownership of a text. If we look at the use of MT in professional workflows, there are a number of stakeholders that we might consider. So there's the client. Is the client aware of the risks, the liabilities of MT use? Are they aware that they might be liable if there are translation errors that cause financial damage, that cause legal consequences, that cause injury to someone? And we'll come to those risks in a moment. There's the translation agency, shares out the material. They're the shareholders. So the shareholders are usually primarily interested in a return of investment, but they also have an interest in the good name of the company to which they're contributing. There are translators, in-house or freelance. There are end users. Do the end users care where their texts come from as long as it's error-free? Or do they care about the process and the fact that maybe everyone hasn't been treated fairly throughout the production of their text, or maybe they have, and maybe that's a process that they can be satisfied that they've contributed to. There are tool developers. What is the ideology behind the creation of their tool? Where is the data stored? All those questions we had earlier. So usually the rule of thumb for the use of machine translation, or the use of automation in translation, goes along the continuum of perishability. So Andy Way in 2013 and in 2018 suggested that the amount of automation in translation should be roughly equivalent to the life cycle or the shelf life of a text. If a text, like for example, a tweet, which has a half-life of 2 hours, if that's to be translated well, it's not going to be a very rewarding task to translate it. And aside from that, a human translator will just probably take too long. So there's no point in it not being machine translated. Yet, on the other hand, it's indefinitely searchable. So that does bring a risk that translation, or that tweet is there unless you delete it. Maybe it can still be found otherwise. There might be screenshots taken to it. If it's still there on Twitter, then the machine translation of it is dynamic, depending on whatever current technology is plugged into Twitter. So even if a translation is not embarrassing or risky in one stage, that doesn't mean it won't be in the future. If there are injuries, who is liable? A machine translation system by itself is not yet considered strong enough to hold copyright. But if there's a risk related to it, the person who makes the arrangements, the programmer or the person who makes the arrangements for setting up a system, even if there's no one who directly programs it, is the person who assumes risk and liability. The assumption behind artificial intelligence or machine learning is that it's not explicitly programmed, but instead that it draws in inferences from the data. It looks for patterns in data. So making arrangements is a way to include the person who is behind a system rather than explicitly programming it. And looking at the continuation of risks, this is something that was been put forward by Carmen Canfora and Angelica Ottman, who you can see on the right-hand side, in their writing about translation risk as part of their company, De-Risco Scouts. So at the lower end, there's the risk of communication being impaired or impossible. the loss of reputation, of financial damage, of legal consequences, of damage to property, and at the higher end, injury or death. So if we think of medical device translation, if we think of translation of documentation for medicines, documentation for food, instructions for machinery, there's a high risk there, and therefore there should be a great deal of human oversight. Sustainability needs to be a consideration too for the future of many industries. In translation, the impacts are well underway for a couple of reasons. First of all, I mentioned in the previous session that MT post editing became a fast-growing area of the translation market since 2010. It now seems to have peaked at around 4% of the total marketplace. So that predated the shift from statistical to neural MT. But increasingly, we're thinking of a broader interpretation of sustainability beyond just ecological and environmental sustainability, considering sustainability of work, workplace, work system sustainability. And Sustainable Development Goal 8 focuses on sustainable economic development and fair and decent work for all. In the paper I wrote about digital Taylorism in translation, I linked that back to work on job satisfaction and Hertzberg's motivation factors, his motivation hygiene theory, thinking about what sort of factors make us satisfied and motivated in work. So there are factors that would be demotivating if they're not present, to do with salary, to do with the amount of time spent working, to do with our contractual situation. But the things that actively satisfy us are a little bit different. So these are things like self-efficacy, or contributing to work that is valuable to society, challenging work, recognition for achievement, responsibility, meaningful work, being involved in decision-making, having a sense of importance to an organization. If we look at factors of job satisfaction, the likes of Kriva and the Happiness Institute in Denmark talk about work that has meaning, having mastery of our work, having a good balance in work, having opportunities for leadership, of influence, being able to have a sense of achievement, having supportive colleagues. This isn't necessarily the case in all translation workflows, especially for those in which digital Taylorism is imposed, where we're dealing with decomposed sections of text or of multimedia material. Another consideration here is diversity. Is there diversity amongst developers and amongst users? The people who are behind technology may just not notice certain elements where there's bias perpetuated from systems. So it's important that there's representation of different groups, different genders, different types of people in development. Equally, in MT output, are those texts all from specific areas? Is there a bias in that in the texts? So we might look at the work by Stefan Ballmer, for example, in his PhD. He's looking at the uses of machine translation by microcomputers. We might look at the language that's being used, the work by Carlos Colantes Frail, who he's looking at the language that's being used for migrants. Are they migrants? Are they refugees? Each of these terms are politically loaded. And we might consider computers as implicit ethical agents, the idea of trying to program in ethical behavior. And it's something that has been put forward as an idea, but hasn't really worked in practice as yet. So where should the oversight be? So I'm coming to the end for this workshop now, but in closing, I think it's important that as MT quality improves, as it facilitates more communication, that ethical concerns are considered by MT developers, by translation buyers, by translation agencies, by translators and consumers of translation. It's important for us as educators, but also for our students and our graduates to have these considerations at heart, whether they end up as freelance workers, whether they move into or out of the translation industry, whether they're decision makers in the future. And when working with MT and using MT, to consider the fit with your values, the purposes, the principles. If we look at, for example, the recent website on free movement within the EU, there is a disclaimer about the fact that some of the material in the Reopen EU website is machine translated out of necessity because it's just down to timeliness. So if we have to use MT, should we use a disclaimer? Do users think it's worthwhile to have this trade-off of convenience versus risk? So there are a number of pieces I've written or contributed to regarding this. Some are available now. There's generally a pre-publication open source version available. And some of these are linked in the references. So the copyright and reuse of translation as data chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Technology, my work with Marta Rocky on ethics in the translation industry, but also there are others that I'd recommend. The work of Christina Abdallah primarily, the work by Emily Bender and others on the danger of stochastic parrots, Carmen Canfor and Angelica Hoffman's work on risks in neural machine translation, and Amanda Lynn's Paulada's How Does Machine Translation Shift Power? So these should be searchable, and Dorothy Kenny's Ethics of Machine Translation. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you very much for the comments in chat from Raphael, from Gregorek. If you have any specific questions, do please free to pop them in there before they power everything off.
Hi, is it possible to hear me actually?
Yes, I can.
Ah, great. So it's Raphael. I don't know if I turned my video on, but I don't think that you can see me anywhere. Yeah.
No.
Oh no, yeah. If I put the gallery, I can see myself at least now. In the gallery view, you can change it if you want. Thank you for those insights. I think it's a topic that we'll all have to deal with in one way or another if you're working at translation studies departments, right? And I was wondering if you know of projects where there is some like participatory technology assessment taking place, or other forms of like in other fields where we had a lot of technological progress, like genetically manipulated organisms and so on. There has been a lot of assessment of how this impacts society, how this impacts other parts of humanity, and then rules were established based on that. And I was wondering how this is now being done for machine translation, or if you have any insights or ideas on that.
It's an area that I haven't found that much on, and I have actively tried to search for writings and research in this area, because myself and Anna Gerberoff were contributing a chapter about ethics and the end user to a forthcoming book about ethics and machine translation that will be on Springer, that's co-edited by Helena Moniz and Carla Parra Escartin. And there isn't much specifically to do with machine translation. there is the more general discussion about large language models, and that's the sort of thing that I was referring to in this stochastic parrots paper, the one by Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, Macmillan Major, and Meg Mitchell, who was under a pseudonym because she was a Google employee at the time that the paper was published, and was banned from being included as a co-author. But beyond these sort of writings in large language models, there doesn't seem to be that much written specifically about the effect of machine translation and the risks on society, other than the work by Lynn Bowker and Jairo Buitrago on machine translation literacy, which would be very relevant in this area. And it's something that she's promoted for some time. Is there anything that you've come across, Raphael?
No, not yet. I'm just like, as I'm personally working on a very different field, like on translation in social sciences and humanities, I'm more like observing what is being done, and I was wondering what exists in that area, because I think it would be highly relevant to have more work in that direction. Yeah, no, unfortunately not, but I will follow what's happening next.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely scope for, those of us who are interested in applying sociological theories to translation to, maybe those can be used to try and model how the influences might work throughout the public, throughout society. It's difficult to measure this sort of thing. That's
true, yeah. What I was thinking about is like cooperations between, I don't know, translation scholars, machine translation developers, and people from science and technology studies who are more specialized in studying the effects and the impacts and so on of technological developments, scientific developments on society.
Yeah, so far I'm seeing one-way traffic from STS into translation studies. So I've seen the use of Scott by the likes of Masaru Yamada and Akiko Sakamoto. There's been a couple of studies that have used Scott, and there's the new Mae Volahan book on practice theory. She's used Pickering's Dance of Agency in the past, but from any of the STS scholars that I read, and I don't claim to be as widely read as I'd like in STS, I haven't seen very much written, but maybe there's an argument that, we need to reach across there rather than just borrowing their ideas, I suppose.
Yeah. At our department, Stefan Baumgarten, I don't know, and Michael Tiba did a panel at our local STS conference. I don't know, were you involved there? No, I guess.
Yes,
you were. Yeah. And I think the same problems persisted, that there wasn't much interaction with the actual STS crowd, right?
It was a curious thing, because we had all paid to be part of this big conference, but in practice there wasn't an exchange, and it was just the regular translation study.
Yeah, that's also the problem of the virtual environment.
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. I agree. But the work that Stefan and Michael are doing is very valuable in this regard, and the forthcoming special issue of Perspectives that they've dubbed Mean Machines. I hope that there'll be some more interesting developments and publications in it. A question here from Maho Fukuno. Thank you so much. A comment rather than a question. It's made me think that using MTs actually require humans, including translators, to reflect more on their own moral values, principles, and what it means to live well. Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that entirely. And if that's an outcome from today, I'm very pleased with it. So thank you very much for that comment. Arigatou gozaimashita.